"It's been too long without a man," the giant widow said, the lone rancher. The sun was low in the sky, painting the endless prairie in shades of gold and amber. Dust swirled softly over the dry ground, carried by a gentle wind that whispered through the tall grasses. On this quiet evening, a lone rider appeared on the horizon, moving steadily across the open land. His name was Eli Thompson, a rancher by trade. Though he had spent most of his life wandering, he carried no one's burdens but his own, and the weight of solitude was a familiar companion. Eli's horse, a sturdy chestnut with a calm temperament, trotted steadily along the old dirt road. Eli had ridden many miles that day, and though his back ached and his hands were raw from the reins, he felt a certain peace in the rhythm of travel. Out here, away from towns and their chatter, away from people who asked too many questions, he could be himself. Yet even in this freedom there was a flicker of curiosity in his heart. Somewhere ahead lay a small town he had heard about through whispers on the trail, a place at the edge of the prairie, where rumors spoke of a woman unlike any other. She was Margaret Harlan, a widow known for her height, her strength, and her stubborn independence. Some said she was a giant of a woman, commanding in every way, able to manage her late husband's ranch with skill and authority. Others whispered that no man had ever stayed with her for long. She had lived alone since the day her husband had died, her life a mixture of hard work and careful routine. To outsiders she seemed unapproachable, yet there was an undeniable aura about her, a mixture of pride, sadness, and courage, that drew attention wherever she went. As Eli rode into town, the wooden buildings and dusty streets seemed almost frozen in time. The town's general store had a few people lingering on the porch, their eyes turning toward the newcomer. The wind carried the smell of fresh bread from the bakery and the tang of horses from the corral. Eli dismounted in front of the inn, a modest building with creaking floorboards and a wooden sign swinging in the breeze. Bah! He led his horse inside the stable, securing it carefully before entering the inn itself. The innkeeper, a cheerful woman with streaks of gray in her hair, greeted him warmly. "A traveler, huh?" she said, wiping her hands on a flour-dusted apron. "You won't find many strangers around here." "Name's Clara. You look like you've ridden a long way." Eli offered a tired but polite smile. "Eli Thompson. Just passing through. I'll take a room for the night." Clara nodded, leading him to a small room upstairs. The walls were plain, the bed firm, but it had the simple comforts of shelter and privacy. Eli set his belongings down and looked out the window. The prairie stretched endlessly beyond the town, the sun casting long shadows over the land. In the distance, he could see the faint outline of a large ranch, its fences stretching wide, livestock grazing lazily.
He knew this was Margaret Harlan's domain, and curiosity stirred in him.
Word traveled fast in small towns, and it wasn't long before Eli heard about the widow. The locals spoke in hushed tones at the inn, their eyes glancing toward him as if to see his reaction. "You heard about Margaret Harlan?" one man asked. "Tall woman. Breaths. Strong as an ox. She runs her late husband's ranch alone."
No man's ever lasted long with her. Ellie listened quietly, nodding slightly.
He didn't reveal whether he was intimidated or intrigued. The tales only made him more curious. He had spent his life working land, raising cattle, and living with the quiet companionship of the animals he tended. But Margaret Harlan, she was different. There was something magnetic about a person who carried both strength and solitude with such visible pride. Eli felt a pull, a sense that fate had guided him to this town, to this ranch, and perhaps to this woman. The next morning, Eli decided to explore the town and get a better sense of the place. The streets were quiet, with only a few townsfolk going about their business. Children ran barefoot across the dusty roads, laughing as they chased a stray dog. Farmers returned from the fields, their faces sunburned and rough, their hands calloused. The innkeeper waved from her porch, and the smell of fresh coffee and bread followed him as he walked. When he reached the edge of town, Eli's eyes fell upon the Harlan Ranch. It was a vast expanse of land, stretching as far as the eye could see. The fences were strong but old, the barns solid and well used. Horses and cattle moved calmly within the pens. And there, in the distance, he saw her. Margaret Harlan was standing tall, her posture straight and unyielding. She carried herself with the confidence of someone who knew every inch of her land and every responsibility it held. She was measuring the fence line, a hammer in her hand, her sleeves rolled up, exposing strong arms that spoke of years of labor. Eli felt a mixture of awe and respect. He had worked hard all his life, but the sight of Margaret managing her ranch alone, with such authority and efficiency, left him quietly impressed. He lingered at the edge of the property, unsure how to approach. He had learned long ago that some people required patience and careful observation before they would accept anyone into their lives. Margaret Harlan seemed one of those people. Their first encounter happened unexpectedly. As Eli walked along the dusty road near the ranch, he spotted a horse that had slipped its rope and wandered dangerously close to a steep ravine. Without thinking, he ran forward, catching the animal and securing it to a nearby post. Margaret had been watching from a distance, her eyes narrowing as she took in the scene.
"You're a little bold for a stranger," she said when he turned toward her.
Her voice was firm but not unkind. Most men would have left that horse to its own devices. Eli tipped his hat politely. "Couldn't let it get hurt," he replied simply. "Animals have enough trouble surviving without people making it worse." Margaret studied him for a long moment. Breath. There was something in his calm demeanor and quiet confidence that intrigued her. "I'm Margaret," she said finally, extending a hand. First, it was firm, much like her presence. "You're Eli, right?" Breaths. "I've heard some things. I prefer to hear things for myself," Eli said, shaking her hand. Their eyes met, and in that silent exchange an unspoken understanding began to form. A recognition of strength, independence, and perhaps a shared solitude. For the rest of the day, Eli helped her with small chores around the ranch. He repaired a broken fence post, carried feed to the livestock, and learned the rhythms of life on the Harlan Ranch. Margaret, usually reserved, allowed him into her space cautiously, observing how he moved, how he worked, and how he treated the land and animals. By evening, there was a sense of mutual respect, subtle but undeniable. As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the prairie in fiery reds and soft purples, they both paused to watch. Breath. Margaret leaned against a post, her tall figure silhouetted against the sky. Eli stood beside her, feeling the quiet strength in her presence. "It's been too long without a man," Margaret said quietly, almost to herself. Her voice was soft but carried the weight of years spent in solitude. Eli did not respond immediately. He sensed that this was not a casual remark but a reflection of her life, her loneliness, and the careful boundaries she had built. He only nodded, offering neither judgment nor intrusion. Instead, he stayed by her side, silent and steady, letting the wind and the fading light speak the words neither of them dared to say. That night, as Eli returned to the inn, he felt a strange mix of anticipation and unease. He had come to this town as a traveler, a lone rancher with no attachments. Yet, in the brief hours spent at the Harlan Ranch, something had shifted. There was curiosity, a spark of recognition, and perhaps the first hint of a connection that neither distance nor time could easily sever. The prairie outside the window was quiet, but Eli's mind was alive with possibilities. Somewhere ahead lay challenges, decisions, and perhaps even a new chapter in a life that had long been solitary. And as he drifted to sleep, the wind carrying whispers from the open fields, He could not help but wonder what the days ahead with Margaret Harlan might bring. The next morning, Eli woke to the soft glow of sunlight streaming through the window of the inn. The air smelled faintly of dust and the distant fields, carried in through the half-opened window. He dressed quickly and decided to visit the Harlan ranch again. There was a curiosity in him he could not ignore, a need to understand the woman he had only briefly met, yet who had already left an impression he could not shake. Breath. When Eli reached the ranch, Margaret was already outside, moving along the fence line with her usual precision. Her tall figure was unmistakable against the morning light. She wore a wide-brimmed hat pulled low to shield her eyes from the sun, and her hands were strong and steady, gripping a hammer and measuring tape. The way she worked reminded Eli of the countless hours he himself had spent on the land. There was a rhythm to her movements, a quiet authority that demanded respect, not through words, but through presence. Margaret noticed him almost immediately, though she made no outward sign. She continued with her work, pausing only to nod in recognition. Eli approached slowly, careful not to startle her. "Good morning, Margaret," he said politely, tipping his hat. "Morning," she replied, her voice steady, neither warm nor cold, but measured. She glanced at him briefly, then returned her attention to the fence. Most men would still be sleeping. I don't sleep much in new places, Eli said. Besides, I figured I might help before the day gets too hot. Margaret studied him, her eyes sharp and calculating. There was something different about this man, something steady, something dependable. You work differently than most, she said finally. Most men don't bother with the details. Ration. They see the fence, they see the land, but they don't feel it.
Eli shrugged modestly. I've learned to pay attention.
The land tells you a lot if you listen. She gave a small nod, almost approvingly, and returned to her work. For a while they worked in silence, the sound of hammers and the occasional clatter of tools filling the morning air. Eli noticed the subtle way Margaret moved, her hands strong and sure, her back straight, her eyes constantly scanning the land as if every inch belonged to her and every decision was hers alone. It was a sight both intimidating and impressive. Eventually, Margaret paused, wiping her brow with the back of her hand. You know, she said, breaking the silence, most men would never bother coming back after the first day. They see a strong woman, a woman in charge, and they run. Why are you still here? Ella smiled, faintly. I don't run from strength. I respect it. Desk. And I've been around long enough to know when someone is worth knowing.
Margaret raised an eyebrow, her lips curling into the slightest hint of a smile.
You talk differently than the others. Most men just talk to impress or to hide their fears. You just speak. Break. They continued working together through the morning. Eli helped her mend a broken fence post, carrying heavy planks and hammering nails as Margaret guided him. They joked lightly at times, though both were careful not to reveal too much of themselves. There was a careful dance in their interaction, a balance of curiosity and caution, of respect and wariness. By midday the sun was high, beating down on the prairie with relentless heat. Margaret gestured toward the barn.
We'll take a break. You can rest there.
I'll fetch some water. Inside the barn, Eli sat on a worn wooden crate, watching the light filter through the slats of the walls. Brace. He noticed the careful order of the barn. Tools hung neatly, hay bales stacked precisely, equipment placed exactly where it belonged. This was not the work of someone haphazard or careless. This was the work of someone who took pride in everything she did, someone who had learned to survive and thrive on her own. Margaret returned with 2 tin cups of water. She handed one to him, her fingers brushing his briefly. There was no awkwardness in the gesture, only a subtle acknowledgement of their growing familiarity.
You're different, she said quietly as they sipped the water. I don't often let people work here without asking too many questions.
Most strangers would have bored me by now.
Eli considered her words.
Maybe I'm not like most strangers, he said. I've learned that it takes time to understand someone, and sometimes you have to listen more than you speak. Margaret looked at him carefully. For a moment she seemed to weigh whether she should test him, to see if his quiet words were true. Then she nodded slightly, a gesture of cautious approval. As the afternoon passed, Eli stayed on the ranch, helping Margaret tend to the livestock. He learned how she fed the cattle, checked the fences, and even repaired a water trough that had sprung a leak. She watched him closely, noting his care and precision. It was clear he was no ordinary man. His movements were deliberate, his attention focused, and his respect for the land evident in everything he did. In the quiet moments between work, Margaret and Ellie spoke of simple things: the weather, the seasons, the land itself. They did not rush into personal stories, but shared enough to feel a connection growing. Eli learned that Margaret had lived on this land all her life, that she had faced challenges many could not imagine, and that her husband had died suddenly, leaving her to carry the weight of the ranch alone. "You manage everything yourself?" Eli asked at one point, his voice soft but curious. Margaret nodded. "Narration. Everything."
I've had to.
No one else could do it for me, and I wasn't about to let the ranch fall apart. Her eyes softened for a moment, a flicker of sadness passing through them before she quickly composed herself. "It hasn't been easy." Eli nodded in understanding. "I know what it's like to carry responsibility alone, but it doesn't make it any easier." For a while they worked in silence again, the only sounds being the clatter of tools and the low murmur of cattle. Yet in that silence a quiet understanding developed, a mutual respect born not of words, but of shared effort and shared space. As the day turned to evening, the sky painted in brilliant shades of orange and purple, Eli prepared to leave. But he had planned to return to the inn. But a part of him hesitated.
There was something in Margaret Harlan that drew him, something beyond curiosity or interest.
It was the strength of her spirit, the quiet dignity with which she carried herself, and the hint of loneliness she did not hide, even if she tried to mask it. Margaret watched him as he walked toward the gate. Breaths. "You'll come back tomorrow?" she asked, her voice careful, almost testing. Eli paused, meeting her gaze. "I will," he said simply. "There's more to learn here, and I want to understand." She nodded, a small, almost imperceptible smile touching her lips. "Most men don't stay long. Most men leave when they see the work involved or when they feel out of place." "I'm not most men," Eli said quietly, and he turned to leave, his heart lighter than it had been in years. That night, Eli returned to the inn, his mind still at the ranch. He thought about Margaret, about her quiet strength, her resilience, and the way she carried herself with authority. Desk. He felt an unfamiliar sense of anticipation, not for adventure or work, but for the possibility of companionship, of connection with someone who could match him in spirit and resolve. In the quiet of his room as he drifted to sleep, Eli realized that this ranch, this woman, and the small town at the edge of the prairie had already begun to change him. For the first time in years he felt a sense of belonging, not in a place, but in a presence. And though he did not yet know where this connection would lead, he felt certain that he would return tomorrow and the day after, until he learned every detail of this land, this ranch, and the woman who ruled it with both courage and grace. The next morning dawned cool and quiet over the Harlan Ranch. The prairie stretched endlessly in every direction, the grass shimmering with dew as the first rays of sunlight touched it. Promised. Eli rode in early, as he had promised the day before. His horse's hooves kicked up small clouds of dust along the worn path to the ranch, and the familiar sight of Margaret's tall figure moving among the fences greeted him like an old friend. Margaret noticed him immediately. She was tending to a stubborn calf that had wandered too close to the fence. With a quick movement, she corralled the animal, lifting it gently and setting it back among the others. When she straightened, Eli was watching, quietly admiring the strength and precision of her actions.
"You're early," she said, her voice calm but carrying the faintest note of surprise.
Most men wouldn't bother showing up before breakfast. Eli smiled. "I told you, I like to learn what's going on before the day gets busy." Margaret's lips twitched in the hint of a smile. Rasp. She seemed less guarded today, though still cautious. "I suppose that makes you different," she said. "Different from most. That could be a good thing. Or a bad thing. Time will tell." They began the day's work together, moving along the fence lines, mending broken boards and checking on the livestock. The rhythm of labor was familiar to Eli. Hours spent under the sun, hands busy, body tired but mind focused. Yet being here with Margaret was unlike any work he had ever done. There was a silent conversation between them in every gesture, every glance. They didn't need to speak constantly to understand each other. As they rested under a large oak tree at midday, Margaret brought out a small satchel with bread and dried fruit. She offered it to Eli without a word, and he accepted it gratefully. Sitting side by side, they ate in companionable silence, the only sounds being the soft rustle of leaves and the distant lowing of cattle. "You work well with your hands," Margaret said after a while, her voice softer than usual. "Most men I've met couldn't hold a hammer correctly if their lives depended on it." "I've had a lot of practice, but I've also learned that tools and land are nothing without respect. You respect what you work with, and it gives back in kind." Margaret studied him, a flicker of curiosity in her eyes. "You respect things," she said slowly. "Most people only take." "But that's unusual." Eli looked away for a moment, toward the open fields. "I've had to learn respect the hard way, people. Lost land. Lost chances. You learn quickly that respect matters more than pride." Margaret nodded, as if considering his words carefully. There was something in his tone, a quiet honesty that she hadn't encountered in a long time. Most people she met tried to impress her with stories or wealth, or they tried to hide their fears behind bravado. Eli didn't. He simply existed, steady and reliable, and that steadiness began to break through the walls she had built around herself. The afternoon was spent tending to the water troughs, feeding the animals and inspecting the barns. Eli learned that Margaret had been running the ranch alone for several years. Her husband had died suddenly, leaving her with more land than she could manage alone.
Yet she had faced it head-on, never asking for help unless it was absolutely necessary.
But there was pride in her work, but also a quiet loneliness that Eli sensed but did not press. During a brief pause as they leaned against the fence, Margaret spoke in a softer, more reflective tone. "It's strange," she said. "I've had this land, these animals, this life, but it's still lonely. I've grown used to it, of course." "I don't know any other way." Eli listened carefully, but he did not interrupt or try to offer solutions. He had learned long ago that people like Margaret did not want pity. They wanted understanding. Loneliness can be heavy, he said gently, but it doesn't have to last forever. Margaret looked at him for a long moment, as she saw sincerity in his eyes, a quiet strength that wasn't boastful or loud. For the first time in years, she felt the idea of trust forming. Not fully, but enough to notice it, to feel its possibility. Maybe, she said finally, her voice almost a whisper. Maybe not forever. As the sun began to dip toward the horizon, Eli helped her finish the chores for the day. The ranch looked different in the late light, warm, peaceful, and almost welcoming. There was satisfaction in seeing the fences straight, the livestock safe, and the land orderly. But more than that, Eli felt a connection forming, subtle and unspoken, with the woman who had captivated his attention from the moment he first arrived. That evening, as they sat on the porch of the ranch house, sharing a simple meal, the conversation grew more personal. Margaret spoke carefully, recounting memories of her husband, not in sorrow, but in quiet reflection. She remembered the early days of marriage, the joy of building a home, the challenges of managing a ranch together. And then she spoke of his death, the suddenness of it, and how she had been forced to shoulder everything alone. Eli listened quietly, nodding, offering small gestures of understanding. "It must have been hard," he said finally, "to carry everything by yourself." It was. Some days it still is. But you adapt. You survive.
You find a rhythm that keeps you going, and yet...
Breaking. Sometimes you wish for someone to share it with.
Ellie felt a quiet warmth in his chest.
He knew that feeling all too well. The longing for companionship after years of solitude.
He had wandered the prairie for most of his adult life, never staying in one place too long, never letting anyone get too close.
But here, with Margaret, he felt a strange pull, a sense that perhaps he had finally found someone who could understand both his strengths and his silences. As night fell and the stars appeared, the ranch quiet and peaceful under the vast prairie sky, they shared stories of their pasts. Margaret spoke of her childhood, of learning the ways of the land, of the pride she felt in keeping the ranch running. Eli spoke of his travels, the families he had known, and the lessons the land had taught him. They laughed quietly at small memories and moments, and in that laughter a subtle bond began to grow. By the end of the night, there was a new understanding between them. Margaret no longer saw Eli as just another passerby or stranger. He was someone steady, someone trustworthy, someone who respected her and the life she had built. And Eli in turn recognized a woman of courage, resilience, and quiet intelligence, a woman who could match him in every way, yet also soften the sharp edges of his solitary life. Before Eli left for the inn, Margaret said softly, almost hesitantly, "You'll come back tomorrow?" "I will," Eli replied simply. "There's more to learn here." "And I want to." Margaret nodded, a small smile touching her lips. For the first time in a long while, she allowed herself a quiet hope, a sense that perhaps she did not have to face the world alone. And as Eli walked back down the dirt path toward the town, the prairie glowing in the moonlight, he felt a sense of anticipation. There was work to do, challenges ahead, and lives to share. But for the first time in years, Eli felt that he was not entirely alone. The prairie night was calm, the wind carrying the soft scent of grass and earth. Eli's thoughts lingered on Margaret, on the strength he admired, and the quiet loneliness she carried. And yet beneath it all he felt a spark, a small but persistent feeling that the days ahead could be brighter, warmer, and richer because they might be shared. As he reached the inn, Ellie paused for a moment at the door. The stars above seemed endless, and the silence of the prairie felt full of possibilities. He stepped inside, ready to rest, yet with his mind already returning to the ranch, to Margaret, and to the growing connection between them. He knew that tomorrow would bring more work, more conversation, and perhaps a deeper understanding. And for the first time in a long while, Eli felt that being part of someone's life, sharing in their struggles, their triumphs, and even their quiet moments, might be something worth staying for. The days passed in a rhythm that was becoming familiar to both Eli and Margaret. Work on the Harlan Ranch was never easy, but together they moved efficiently and quietly through the tasks, building fences, feeding livestock, and tending the fields. The bond between them had grown in small, steady ways through shared labor, quiet conversation, and a growing understanding of each other's strength. Yet, beneath the calm, a shadow was approaching, one neither of them could ignore for long. It began one afternoon with the arrival of a stranger at the edge of the ranch. He was a neighboring rancher, a man named Caleb Drury, whose family had farmed the land for generations. His face was rough, lined with sun and worry, and his eyes carried a glint of resentment. He rode a horse that snorted nervously, and he came directly toward Margaret, ignoring Eli entirely at first. "You Harlan girl," Caleb said, his voice harsh. "I hear you've been running this ranch all on your own. Funny that."
I've got papers that say some of this land doesn't even belong to you. Margaret straightened immediately, her tall frame commanding attention.
"I've been running this land for years," she said calmly. "Everything here belongs to me. My husband's estate is clear, and the land is mine. We'll see about that."
You think being tall and strong gives you the right to take what isn't yours? I won't stand by while you make claims on land that should belong to my family.
Breath. Eli stepped forward, placing himself subtly between Caleb and Margaret. His presence was steady, calm, yet it carried authority. "You're mistaken," Eli said quietly. "Margaret owns this land, and she's the one who's been working it day in and day out." Breaths. "If you have a problem, take it to the courts, not to threats," Caleb snorted, turning his horse slightly. "I don't need lectures from a stranger. You're not from around here, are you?"
No, Eli admitted.
"But I know what I see. I know what's fair. And right now, this is Margaret's land, and I suggest you leave it alone."
Margaret watched the exchange silently, her eyes sharp.
She had faced hostility before, from men who doubted her strength, her intelligence, and her right to run the ranch alone. But this felt different, but to the fragile peace she had built in her life. "You'll find no quarrel with me, Caleb," she had built in her life.
You'll find no quarrel with me, Caleb, she said finally, her voice steady and unwavering.
"But don't think I'll step aside either." Caleb's jaw tightened, and after a tense moment he rode off, leaving a cloud of dust in his wake. Margaret turned to Eli, her hands trembling slightly, not with fear but with the sudden rush of adrenaline that comes from facing danger. "He'll be back," she said softly. Eli nodded. "And when he does, we'll be ready." That evening, as the sun sank low and the sky was painted in deep oranges and purples, Eli and Margaret worked together to strengthen the fences and secure the livestock. Every nail hammered and every board replaced felt like a statement, a declaration that the ranch belonged to her, that she would not be intimidated. Eli's presence brought confidence and support, and Margaret realized that she was beginning to trust him not just as a helper, but as a partner. Yet even as they worked side by side, Margaret could not shake a feeling she had not experienced in years: doubt. She had spent her life relying on herself, building a life she could control, and allowing someone into that life, even someone as steady as Eli, felt risky. Could she let her guard down enough to trust another person? Could she allow herself to depend on someone else when she had spent so long managing everything alone? Eli, too, felt the weight of hesitation. He had wandered the prairie for most of his adult life, avoiding attachments that might slow him down or bring pain. But with Margaret, he had found a connection that went beyond convenience or companionship. He admired her strength, respected her independence, and was beginning to feel something deeper, something he had not allowed himself to feel for years. Yet he too feared stepping too close, for fear that the walls she had built around herself might collapse under the weight of expectation. The tension came to a head a few days later. Caleb Drury returned, this time with a small group of men from the neighboring ranches. Their intent was clear: to intimidate Margaret and assert that the land was theirs. They arrived mid-morning, shouting and spurring their horses, creating chaos among the cattle and frightening the smaller animals. Margaret's face hardened. "Eli," she said firmly, "help me keep the livestock safe. They won't scare me away." Eli moved swiftly, working alongside her to herd the animals into secure pens. Their movements were precise, synchronized almost without speaking. As the men approached the fence line, Margaret stood tall, her voice carrying over the shouts. "This is my land. You will not threaten me or my animals. Leave now, or I will have no choice but to take action." Caleb sneered, underestimating the determination in her tone. "We'll see about that, Margaret. This land belongs to my family." Eli stepped forward, positioning himself between Margaret and the intruders. "Leave her alone," he said, voice steady but firm. "This is her land. There's no reason for violence, but we will defend it if we have to." For a tense moment, no one moved. Breath. Then, slowly, the men realized that Margaret and Eli were not ordinary opponents. Their calm confidence and readiness for confrontation made it clear that intimidation would not work here. After exchanging heated words for several minutes, Caleb signaled his men to retreat, though he did not leave without a warning. "This isn't over," he shouted over his shoulder. As the dust settled, Margaret and Eli surveyed the ranch. The livestock were safe, the fences intact, but the tension lingered. Margaret exhaled deeply, her body still tense from the confrontation.
"I've faced threats before," she said quietly, "but it's been years since I've had someone stand with me like that." Eli placed a hand on her shoulder, not intrusive, just steadying.
"You don't have to face it alone," he said softly. "Not anymore." Margaret's eyes softened for a brief moment, the walls around her heart cracking ever so slightly. Doubt lingered. Could she allow herself to lean on someone? Could she truly trust that Eli would not leave, that he would not falter when the challenges became real? That night, the prairie was quiet, the stars casting a soft light over the ranch. Margaret sat on the porch, her thoughts heavy. She thought about her husband, about the years she had spent managing the land alone, about the pride she felt in her independence, and about the strange, unfamiliar feeling that Eli's presence brought. There was safety in it, comfort, but also fear. Fear of losing control, fear of depending on another person, and fear that her heart might once again be exposed to loss. Eli, meanwhile, slept in the small room he had taken at the inn, but his mind was restless. He thought about the confrontation with Caleb, about Margaret's bravery, and about the quiet bond that had grown between them. He realized that he could no longer think of himself as a wanderer who drifted from place to place. Margaret had awakened something in him, a desire to be present, to protect, and to belong. Yet he, too, feared stepping too close, afraid that his feelings might overwhelm the careful balance they had built. The following morning brought a sense of calm, but the tension of the previous days lingered. Margaret and Eli worked together again, tending to the ranch, repairing fences, and ensuring the animals were secure. Their cooperation was seamless, almost instinctive. Each knew what the other needed, what the land demanded, and how to navigate the challenges that arose. As they paused to rest under the shade of a large tree, Margaret spoke softly.
I've spent my life relying on myself, she said quietly.
It's hard to imagine letting someone in.
Even someone I trust. Eli looked at her, his eyes steady. You don't have to let anyone in all at once, he said.
Trust grows slowly, and I'm willing to wait. I want to be here for you and for this ranch in whatever way you're ready to let me. Margaret's gaze softened. For the first time in years, she felt the possibility of partnership. Not one that diminished her independence, but one that strengthened it. There was still doubt, still fear, but there was also hope, Hope that she didn't have to face life's challenges alone, that someone could share the burdens and joys of the land, and that trust could be rebuilt, slowly and carefully. As the sun set, casting long shadows over the prairie, Margaret and Eli looked over the land together. The ranch was safe, the livestock secure, and the threat from Caleb had passed, at least for now. But more importantly, a new understanding had formed between them, a recognition that they could face challenges together, and that their bond, though still fragile, was growing stronger with every shared task and quiet conversation. Margaret finally allowed herself a small, hopeful smile. Maybe, she said softly, almost to herself, maybe it won't be so long without someone after all. Eli nodded, feeling a quiet warmth in his chest. No, he said softly, narration. And as the night settled over the prairie, the stars above shining like distant promises, both knew that the days ahead would bring trials and doubts, but also the possibility of connection, trust, and perhaps even a shared life on the land they both loved. The days that followed the confrontation with Caleb Drury were quieter, but the tension of the past week had left a mark on both Margaret and Eli. The prairie felt peaceful again, with the wind moving softly through the tall grasses and the livestock grazing calmly in the late afternoon sun. Yet underneath that calm there was a new energy, one of possibility, of connection, and of trust slowly being built between two people who had long lived in solitude. Eli arrived at the ranch early, as was now his habit. Margaret was already outside, checking the fences and ensuring the water troughs were full. Her movements were steady and confident, but Eli noticed a small softness in her eyes that hadn't been there before, a subtle acknowledgement of his presence and of the support he had given during the recent trials. "Morning," he called softly, tipping his hat. "Morning," she replied, a hint of warmth in her tone. "I see you've been keeping your word." Ellie smiled faintly. "I said I'd come back. I always keep my word." Race. They worked together throughout the morning, moving along the fence lines, repairing boards, and checking on the cattle. Their cooperation was seamless. Each knew what the other needed without words. There was a quiet rhythm to their labor, a rhythm that spoke of growing understanding and mutual respect. The tasks were not easy, but together they made them feel lighter, even enjoyable. During a short break under the shade of a large oak, Margaret glanced at Eli. "You've been here several days now," she said thoughtfully. "Most men wouldn't last this long, Brett. Most would have left after the first challenge or the first long day of work." Eli leaned back against the fence, watching the prairie stretch endlessly. "Maybe most men aren't like me," he said softly. "I don't run from work, or from people, or from life. I face what comes, and I stay if I feel it's right."
Margaret studied him carefully.
His quiet honesty, his strength without arrogance, had begun to chip away at the walls she had built around herself. She had spent years living alone, relying only on her own skill and resolve, but now she was beginning to see that partnership did not mean weakness. Friends, sometimes it could mean strength shared, burdens halved, and victories celebrated together. The afternoon brought the usual tasks of the ranch: feeding livestock, moving hay, checking fences, but there was a lightness in the air. The shadow of conflict with Caleb seemed distant now, and for the first time in years, Margaret allowed herself to feel a sense of ease in Eli's presence. They spoke freely, sharing small stories and moments from their past, laughing softly at minor mishaps and the stubbornness of animals. Brass. As the sun began its slow descent toward the horizon, painting the prairie in brilliant oranges and purples, Margaret and Eli walked together toward the barn. Bad. He glances around and desk between the edges of the fluids, which is still or stuck. You know, Margaret said quietly, breaking the comfortable silence, I never thought I'd feel lighter. I've carried this ranch, these responsibilities, all on my own for years. I thought I had to. I thought no one could help me without making things worse. Ellie glanced at her, his eyes warmed. Sometimes the right person makes it easier, not by taking over, but by standing with you. That's what I want. To stand with you, Margaret, not to replace anything you've done or built. Margaret looked down at her hands for a moment, then back up at him. There was a flicker of vulnerability in her gaze, something she rarely showed anyone.
It's been so long since I've let anyone in, she admitted softly.
I wasn't sure I could. I wasn't sure I wanted to. Eli's hand moved gently to rest on hers, steady and reassuring. You don't have to decide all at once, he said quietly. We take it one day at a time. We face the land together, the challenges, and whatever else comes. I'll be here. For the first time in years, Margaret allowed herself a smile, one that was soft, genuine, and free of hesitation.
The walls she had built around her heart began to feel less like barriers and more like something that could be shared, strengthened rather than broken.
They sat on the porch of the ranch house watching the sun sink behind the distant hills. The sky was a canvas of deep reds, purples, and gold, and the prairie stretched endlessly beneath it, peaceful and timeless. The air was filled with the quiet sounds of nature, the lowing of cattle, the rustle of leaves, and the distant calls of birds returning to their nests.
You know, Margaret said, her voice soft, almost hesitant, it's been a long time since I felt like this.
But hope. Not just for the ranch, but for myself. Eli looked at her, his eyes reflecting the colors of the sunset. I understand, he said. I've spent years wandering, moving from place to place. Breath. I never stayed, never let myself feel connected. But here, with you, it feels different. And I want to stay, Margaret. I want to be part of this life, part of this ranch, part of your world. Margaret's heart stirred in a way it hadn't for many years. Wary of letting someone in, but Eli's presence had shown her that trust could be given carefully, without losing oneself. She nodded slowly, a quiet determination in her eyes. Breath. Then, we'll see how it goes. Together, she said, her voice steady and hopeful. Days turned into weeks, and life on the Harlan Ranch began to settle into a new rhythm. Lee and Margaret worked together, laughed together, and learned to rely on one another without fear. Caleb Drury never returned, discouraged perhaps by the unwavering strength and unity they now displayed. The ranch prospered, the livestock were healthy, and the fences stood strong, symbols not just of land but of partnership and resilience. One afternoon, as they walked along the fence line checking the cattle, Margaret stopped and looked at Eli, her eyes thoughtful. You know, she said quietly, it's been too long without a man, too long without someone who understands, who stands beside me, rather than behind or ahead of me. Eli smiled softly, feeling warmth spread through his chest. Then maybe. It's not too long anymore, he replied. His voice was calm, gentle, and full of certainty.
Brick.
Margaret laughed softly, a sound that felt lighter than it had in years. She nudged him playfully with her shoulder.
Maybe not, she said, her eyes shining with a mix of amusement and hope. That evening they sat together on the porch, watching the sun set over the prairie. The world was calm, peaceful, and full of promise. Margaret leaned slightly against Eli, feeling the comfort and steadiness of his presence. He placed a hand gently on hers, and in that quiet moment, the loneliness of years seemed to lift. They were no longer solitary figures against the vast prairie. They were partners, companions, and friends, bound by trust, respect, and the possibility of love. The ranch was more than a place to live. It was a life built together. And in each shared task, each quiet conversation, each moment of laughter or reflection, they discovered that true partnership was not about dependence or surrender, but about standing together, supporting each other, and facing the world as equals. As night fell and the stars appeared, vast and countless over the prairie, Margaret spoke softly, almost to herself, yet loud enough for Eli to hear. It's been too long without someone, but perhaps now it's enough. Enough to build, to share, to live. He glances around in despair. Eli nodded, his eyes fixed on the same sky, feeling a sense of belonging he had never known. Not just enough, he said quietly, but a beginning. A new chapter. Together. The wind whispered through the grasses, carrying with it the promise of a future bright with possibility. The ranch, the land, and their lives were no longer solitary. They had found strength, companionship, and hope in each other. The prairie stretched endlessly before them, vast and beautiful, a mirror of the life they would face together, strong, steady, and shared. And as they sat side by side, watching the moon rise over the quiet land, both Eli and Margaret knew that they had found something rare and lasting, a bond forged through struggle, nurtured by respect, and solidified by the quiet courage to trust again. The loneliness of the past had ended, and a new life, rich with promise and companionship, had begun.